So can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So Beth and I have been sort of driving around town in Newport, looking at a lot of the trees, and it's always nice for me to do because when you have somebody new with you, it kind of reminds you of how beautiful a place Newport really is. And you know, I've been fortunate to be able to serve as a Bartlett arborist in Newport. So for those of you that, I know most people in here, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Fletcher. I'm an arborist for Bartlett Tree Experts. I've been managing Southern Rhode Island for Bartlett Tree Experts for a number of years. And so I've got about a half-an-hour presentation, and then Beth is going to come up and do her presentation for about a half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. And so what I'd like to do today is start with a poem, and I won't get too artsy-fartsy or anything like that. I know some people get nervous when you start talking poetry. But if you know Robert Frost, and the first poem that I'm going to do is a very short poem. If you know Robert Frost, then you know that Robert Frost was known for writing in very simple language, very accessible, and writing about nature. And in this poem, what you're going to see him talking about is a very small moment. And for me, I'm all about small moments. I think that small moments in life, you know, over time add up to being sort of the most informative moments in life. And I'm going to try to show you that through the eyes of an arborist, through time, place, and the perspective of an arborist. And so the poem, of course, goes, the way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree, has given my heart a change of mood and changed some part of the day I rued. And so you have this really small moment. Now, when you look at snow coming down off of a hemlock tree, maybe falling down your neck, that could be a very annoying moment, right? We don't quite know why Frost found that to be such a beautiful moment. It could be that it's just the mischievousness of the crow, the snow on the hemlock tree, the beauty of it. But with Frost poems, when you look at them over time and through the experiences in your life, you can take his poems and generally carry them with you, and they expand with you. And so in talking about time, place, and perspective, I'm going to start with place first, because place has to do with where we came from. And so place is a hard thing to actually definitively define, because maybe when you're a kid, you know, I'm from the town of Bristol. Born, bred, I'll probably die in there. I live in a cemetery. You know, my wife will find me on the side of the hill. She'll kick me into my grave and it'll be done with. But, you know, place was a scent. There I am as a little kid thinking that maybe when I grew up I wanted to be a doctor. Place is also that place, you know, where home is. And Frost has a beautiful poem about home where he says that home is the place that you shouldn't have to deserve. And so place for me as a child was that place where I could experiment, I could make mistakes, I could, you know, try to figure out who I wanted to be. And over time for me, I worked for Ralph Kinder, who was the uncle of Sam Kinder. They were a very complicated family. And Ralph owned the florist shop in Bristol, but he was the caretaker of Juniper Hill Cemetery, so he sort of became my mentor. I was a very shy and quiet kid, and Ralph Kinder kind of pulled me out of that. But Ralph was the 7th keeper of Juniper Hill Cemetery, and I'm the 8th. And so, in terms of building a sense of place, when I walked through that cemetery, this was a 19th century garden-style design, and when you look at that map, when I'm walking through those grounds, I can see the lines of that map in the cemetery. And oftentimes my wife will be on the phone and it'll be somebody with a lot in the cemetery, and I'll hear her name and I'll say, that's at such and such place. And so Juniper Hill Cemetery, in terms of taking care of it, at first, I was a high school kid. I went in there, you know, did what I had to do, and the last thing I wanted to do was to sit and listen to an old man talk about the old days, the 1930s and all of that sort of thing. But I did, and I'm so glad I did. And so Juniper Hill has become a big part of my life. People in Bristol will say to me, we can't picture Juniper Hill without Chris Fletcher there. And what a compliment that is. And so one of the interesting things, actually, before I get to that picture, is that stone up there is, it's loaded with, Juniper Hill is loaded with history, because Bristol was the largest slave hauling town in the world after it was made illegal by the United States. But that stone up to the right would have been Josephine. It was Charles Dana Green's, mixing up names. It was Charles Gibson, you know, the Gibson girls, and his mother and his wife and his daughter were the original models for the Gibson girls, and that's where the mother is buried. But so I raised my family there, and it was a beautiful place to raise kids. It was awesome for them. They had 33 acres to run around in. And so today, that whole cemetery was built in completion. Today you only see about maybe a third of it, because a lot of the families through the Depression and everything had moved out of the area. And so there's the home that I live in, where I raised my kids. And so when I think about a dust of snow coming off a hemlock tree, those branches from that hemlock tree for me come right from that. That tree had an 8-foot diameter trunk. And you see the window all the way to the right on the first floor. I like to write, and I keep journals. And I sit in my favorite spot, and I used to love to sit out and look at this hemlock tree. And when it went, I never thought, what am I going to do? Well, when that tree went down, there were all sorts of older, bigger trees there. We didn't replace it. And it still looked like a really beautiful scene. And so we talk, as we move through time, we gain experience. And through time and place, that's where we get our perspectives from. And we can change our perspectives within very small moments. So for me, all the way up until this last winter, I used to be able to sit on my deck and look out across Bristol Harbor, and I would see this beautiful weeping beech tree with the beautiful sunsets that we've been having over the past 5 or 10 years. And that beautiful chapel that stands there, that's a unique structure in New England. It's an actual Roman chapel that you would be more likely to see in southwestern United States. When we had the roof redone, Kirby did it. They couldn't figure out how to do it because they had never done tile on a concrete structure. So it's concrete with stucco on it. And so they found the company that actually made these tiles back in the mid-19th century. And they went for 2 weeks to learn how to put these tiles on this building. And so that's the picture of those two trees at one time. There's the hemlock. And on the left, through the course of time over about 100 years, other caretakers, including me, would have pruned that tree like a curtain. And so that curtain existed and grew within this very small circular space. There's a driveway on the right side that goes to the chapel. And it was just an amazing curtain of green. It was awesome. And so I was delighted when my son and my daughter-in-law decided to have their wedding ceremony and their reception in the cemetery. And the focal point of a lot of their pictures were around this weeping beech tree, which I found awesome. But here's what's left. And so when you look at something like this is going to happen in all landscapes. And people like Jeff Curtis and I and other caretakers that are here in this room, we're all seeing those older trees that are reaching their lifespans. We're all seeing these landscapes change. And we need to keep in mind what we saw in the past so that we can pass something along the way people who planted these very trees did. But through time, this has all changed and my perspective has changed. I have a memory that I'll maintain and I'll keep moving forward. And not necessarily, as Beth and I were talking today, not necessarily that we have to do the same thing that the people did prior to, because that building is a nice looking building. We may want to do something a little bit different. And so with perspective, you know, when I get to properties, you see the house off there in the distance? I knock on a door, people come to the door, come on in, no, you come out. As an arborist, we see trees from the inside out. This is the perspective that we have. And so I'm more interested in what's going on underneath those canopies than I am about that house. Even though I appreciate and completely understand the significance of those buildings and the people in them that provided the resources for all of this stuff to happen. But for most people, trees are backdrops. They're these structures that give us shade. They frame in views, but they're kind of out there. And most people don't stand under trees and look at them long enough, or in different daylight, different seasons, different perspectives as we age and change and our moods change. As we change and our moods change and our perspectives change, the trees change too, and I'll show you that. So when I do get home at the end of an evening, I'll stop by here. This is a Japanese maple garden. Bartlett Tree Experts, Juniper Hill Cemetery, Rindler, our professional organization, DuPont Landscaping, Kinder Brothers all came together and created this Japanese garden in memory of my son. I had a son who had muscular dystrophy. He lived a great life. I had no regrets. But when I step out my back door, oh wait, you know, so here's a change in perspective of that landscape, the difference between the fall and the beauty that you see. And then this is a different kind of beauty. You know, some people might see gloom here. When I see gloom here, it brings out, sometimes it brings out tears in me. And when I have tears, that's when I know I am closest to my son and to my son's memory. And so that landscape serves that purpose for me. And when I look into that landscape, I know the history of that tower back there. It was the base of a water mill, a windmill. And so when I look at a landscape like that, my perspective is different from most people's. When I step out my back door, I look to the left at that tree. And so James Ingram, the president of our company, placed all of those Japanese maple trees. And I'm sure, knowing his personality, he claimed that he put that tree in that spot for the reason that I'm going to tell you right now. When I step outside in the fall and the sun comes through the trees in the distance, it lands right on that beautiful coral bark Japanese maple tree. And it just highlights, my son's ashes are under that tree. And it just highlights my experiences that I had with my son. And so when I step out further onto a small deck and then go up those stairs, I get to my small perch up there. I have a deck on a set of rocks. And so on an evening like that, I love that. It's like there's a blanket of night. And where I sit up there, you can hear all the sounds of Bristol. I can hear the 4th of July parade sounds, I can hear the football games, I can hear the baseball games, I can hear the bands playing downtown, I can hear the cars. But as the darkness descends, it's like a blanket being put over the world. And I'm able to sit in that little perch there and enjoy a beer, a glass of wine. and just reflect with my own thoughts. And then when you look at this scene, it's a completely different place. There's my Jack Russell Terrier, and she's a real terrorist. But she's with me all the time. I wish I could get her to go do her own thing once in a while. But when you look out and you look between those spruce trees, now when they built that garden, I had a bunch of arborists, and they said, "You have water out there." And I'm like, "No, I like the lining of the trees. I love looking at the skyline at night with those trees there." And of course they said no. They opened this hole, and I have this view over Bristol Harbor. And with the boats and everything there, it's not a very big view, but I don't ever want to lose that view. You can see clear across western Rhode Island, all the way across Cranston. And there's the same scene standing in front of that deck with a whole different perspective, a winter wonderland, you know. And every time, you can't get sick of it. It just changes and changes. And so getting back into the cemetery, so as I've walked the cemetery over the years, you know, sometimes I see an element on a gravestone that I've never noticed before, and I'm like, how have I not noticed that in 30 years? And the same with trees. I started to realize that, you know, there are experiences here that I should probably record and share with people. So this native red maple, it may have been one of the first trees on the property. The property was the farm of Levi DeWolf, who participated in that slave-hauling family. And so when you look at this tree, you see multiple stems growing out of it. At one time, Juniper Hill almost would have been like a cemetery above the Hudson. You could see from Providence to Newport. Because most of our trees had been cut down in our urban areas because an environment with no trees was considered a clean environment by people from probably the 19th century prior. An opening in a clearing was considered to be safe. And so here's this tree with this beautiful sort of candelabra-like stature, and that's standing over one of the first explorers. I forget his name. It was one of the Hazards, and it was a brother of a famous one that was from South County. But there it is on a different day with the sunlight and the snow on the ground. And as you get closer to this tree, you see those ribs on those stems. Those ribs are reactionary wood. So that tree would have been exposed to the elements at one point in time. And it would have grown those ribs to help build strength. So building ribs is like building a beam, and beams are very strong structures. And so it helps the tree to survive that. Now it could be that that tree was there as part of Levi DeWolf's farm. I've never seen a native red maple tree quite as big as this one or as beautiful. And so cows may have munched on the top of that tree. And then when the cemetery was developed, there wouldn't have been lawnmowers, so they would have scythed it, and they would have scythed that tree. And it just kept sending up stems. And then when the first lawnmower came around, that guy probably decided to cut around the tree. And as you get close to the tree, it's like sculpture, you know? And here it is from a different angle over the Gibson lot in winter with snow and sunshine, just sunshine in winter. And if anybody like Jeff and other people here who work outside, and you're out there in the winter and you have that bright sunny day, and it might even be freezing out, but you're dressed properly, it's a beautiful time of the year to be outside. Late summer, fall, and there it is in its full glory. And so getting back towards Newport, you know, people that brought these trees here, They introduced these trees in the same way that they introduced classical architecture. They actually noted the fluted flares of the trees and compared them to the fluted columns in the buildings. And so they saw these trees in their full glory. And so when they brought them back here and planted them, they knew that they weren't going to see, but they knew that our generations, that somebody in the future would see these beautiful, magnificent specimens. And so this is out in front of the elms with the formally pruned beech trees. Americans tend not to like formally pruned trees. You go to Europe and you know, Paris and other European countries, and you see them all over the place. They're part of public works in Paris. And so those trees actually are living as long as the trees that were never pruned like that. But there's one day where I'm standing out there and the sky is gray. I'm getting the shape of those trees. It's not a glorious day. But then I find myself out there, you know, probably collecting information for Jeff, for a proposal. And I stop and I look up and I see the structure of those trees through that skyline. And it was a much more significant picture in real life. But, you know, I stood there and I had that experience and I carried it home with me instead of just my exhaustion from the end of the day. And then I had an intern and I ran out of work for her. So I told her to take her iPhone and take pictures of every single tree on every preservation property. She took like 20 to 30 pictures from different angles of every tree on every Preservation Society property. And I was so glad to have this one, because this is the formal garden, very homesteadian, at the front of the house. And then you have that informally shaped weeping beech. That was meant to draw your attention into the distance, to go off and experience the wooded edge that Olmsted would have developed on all of these properties. And so there was always an aspect of surprise and mystery in the way Olmsted did his landscapes and people at that time. This is a beautiful grove. What is it, 4 or 5 trees, Jeff? 5, yeah. And they're not all weeping, right? But some of them have that weeping shape in there. And it's just beautiful. When I go out on a landscape like this, I remember the snow crunches under my feet. I remember my father taking me and my siblings, and I was always last in line. I was kind of the trouble kid. And there was one particular, there was only one really big beech tree in the woods at Mount Hope. And it was an American beech tree, and we would always gather at that point. My father had a cane that was very special to him, that was given to him from a priest that he was very friendly with. And I lost the cane. But when I walk through those landscapes and I hear that crunching of the snow, it brings back all of those memories. And here's the same picture on a sunny day, and you can see how the mood changes. And then when you look at these 2 London plane trees at Marble House, they're pieces of art just as much as that lamppost is and those balusters are. Those are amazing trees. They have huge chains that we use to cable limbs together. I'm not sure exactly why they did that, because it doesn't look like they really needed it. Those chains are huge, like chains from a ship. And then for me, there's the backdrop with that square box in the background that gives us context for where the trees came from. I'm kidding. And with this picture here, I mean, do I need to really say anything about it? It's beautiful. That's a London plane tree. And, you know, when I look at that, and I love having my memory jogged. My father was a storyteller. And so I just love to have my memory jogged when I'm out on properties. That kind of reminds me of Dark Shadows. which was filmed down here, right?
Gnarly.
What's that?
That was gnarly. I've never seen a London plane like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a beautiful tree. So this fernleaf beech here is at Chepstow. So I used to give trolley tours from the Newport Flower Show, and we'd go to the elms, and then we'd go to Chepstow. And the one tree that people would want to bring family members and friends back to is this tree. When you walk underneath this tree, first of all, you've got to get back into child mode. I've got to move the branches out of the way so you can bend over and crawl underneath. You feel like you're in a primeval forest. And there's this beautiful setup of shoots, limbs that have touched the ground and have sprouted around it. Beech trees don't like sunlight on their bark. We never prune live wood off of beech trees unless there's a specific reason. And so it's almost as if those younger beech trees are protecting that bigger, older tree. And look at this picture. I mean, I love that. That's a fall picture. And this tree is up on a big mound. And so in Europe, when they built arboretums, they wanted people to see, it was meant for people to come in and view those arboretums, even if they were private properties. And the same thing in the United States. People were encouraged to open up their properties to the public so that the average American could experience worldwide travel, botany, and they would arrange trees by family. And they would sometimes build mounds and place the trees on top of the mounds so that you got the full spectrum, the architecture of the root flares and the whole tree. And so we can't know whether that mound was built that way, but that's the story I'm going with, because it's the most interesting one. But the tree just changes over time. And there you can see all of those sprouts coming up and how it dwarfs that house. Now, Dr. Frederick from our research facilities, when he would come up, and you don't always know when people say that's the biggest tree on the planet, or, you know, we talk about, it could be that, you know, it's not true, but he would say that Chepstow and Macaulay Hall had the two biggest fernleaf beeches and most magnificent specimens in the United States. And he was a guy who constantly traveled the United States and Europe. We have offices in England and Ireland. And so I take Bruce's words, you know, until he's proven otherwise. But when you look at that limb extending out, the mass of wood that is that limb and the branches that extend out from it are totally dwarfed by the size of the trunk of that tree. You're not really getting the full picture here. And there's that limb straight on. And so here's a tree that we've lost that used to be right out here on these grounds. And this was one of those lindens that, just look at the character and the structure of that tree. And it ripped apart in a storm. That limb on the ground level was absolutely massive. And so here we have a tree at Salve 2 in front of Wakehurst. So when I look at this tree, I can see that this tree was probably pruned improperly. So we don't thin out trees anymore. It's not something that's done. So oftentimes arborists will say, we're going to thin the tree out, the wind will blow through. But what actually happens is there are chemical changes in the way the limb is going to grow. They extend and they turn upward. And they put more growth into extending upward than they do in the base of the limbs. And so this tree was probably pruned improperly a long time ago. And the other thing that people often don't realize is that Newport had most of its trees cut down. The British did a lot of the cutting when they left Newport. But so there are areas that you go to, like at Chateau Semur, where the ring is. What's it called again?
The maze?
No, the stone ring.
Oh,
The Moon Gate. You could see the ocean from all three sides at one point in time. because there would not have been the number of trees that we have here today after they were cut down. And so this tree was probably hit by wind also. And so when you look at this tree, the base of that tree, it's monstrous. But with all of that abuse, it's one of the most beautiful London plane trees I've ever seen. It almost looks like something out of a 1960s horror movie with insects gone bad. And this is the last tree. This is a tree that we did lose, and when we lost it, Salve got 16,000 hits on Facebook from people who had experiences underneath this tree. I could not get enough pictures of this tree. But there it is with its full canopy. And what happened to this tree is, about 30, maybe 35 years ago, it split in half, and everybody predicted that it wasn't going to survive. Well, it survived, and it put out new limbs, and it became this big, monstrous beauty. And so it split apart again, and when it split apart the second time, the part that split out was the last upright piece that we could use to cable the rest of the tree together so that it wouldn't be a hazard. And there's so many students that pass in that area that we had to take the tree down. I had to stand there for 3 days and console people and tell them how the tree had a 30 years worth of extra life. And to help people understand that we are trying to maintain the health of these trees.
How long ago was that tree there? Because I don't remember.
Somebody help me, maybe
5
10?
years?
Yeah.
Because I've been here
Somebody between 5 and 10 years, I would guess. Life to me is becoming 15, 20, or 30 years, and they all blur together.
It had to be more than 8, because I would remember that.
But this tree had Pachysandra, which I know you're not supposed to have under there, but look at the color there. And that tree to me would have been the woods behind my house that, you know, I would have crawled under, crawled on. And it would have become a part of my life. And I think it's important for people today to have those experiences. And we are having fewer and fewer outdoor experiences. And maybe not so much for us in Newport, because even when we walk our streets, the exotic trees in Newport and Bristol, all that were introduced are very, very healthy populations. When we inventoried the trees at Salve and the other properties that I take care of in Preservation Society, we find that the age, so we like to see a nice curve where there are enough young trees to take the place of middle-aged trees that become the old trees. And we want that succession. And so you don't want too many old trees, you want the curve to sort of be in the middle with the middle-aged trees, like a lot of us here. And what we also find is that the population is very, very healthy. And so that's all good news. Now, when you really do get into it, there are a lot of issues right now with weather changes, the way the nursery industry has pretty much destroyed the way to grow trees these days. It's all been, the markets have been taken over by department stores, and if you want a tree that you can take back and get another one for very cheap money, they're going to be grown in a way that's not going to benefit them in their future. And so I've heard statistics, correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, but I've heard that the average lifespan of trees planted today is about 30 years.
And it's even shorter, Chris, in cities.
Right.
So I think that would be reflected.
And we're talking trees that should live to 200, some get to 300 and 400. And so, I kind of lost my train of thought on
Are you talking about trees like that you buy like that only last 30 years at like a retail?
Like at a Home Depot.
there. What's that?
Oh, like a Home Depot or something.
Yeah, right. It was a bigger point, and I totally lost it. Sorry. I gotta take my, what is it, Prevagens?
Sorry.
And there's that tree again. And so, you know, I hope I've just given you sort of a little glimpse of what it's like to be an arborist in terms of how we look at trees. And I hope in the way that Robert Frost sort of brought you into a picture of a very small scene. All of those pictures that I took in this slideshow were moments. I jumped out of my car, I had appointments, I had to do this, I had to do that. There are very, very few in there that took a lot of time. But those moments and the stories that I can tell through those moments become a story eventually in your life that is very meaningful. And I think today people are looking for meaning, and I think we can find it in our landscapes.
Okay to ask a couple questions?
So can we wait for questions, or do you want to do
Oh.
them, or do we want to do them now?
Chris, in the moment.
Go ahead.
So the favorite tree over at your house next to Juniper Hill there,
Yeah.
and that.
The native red maple?
The native red maple.
Yeah, our state tree.
Yeah, that real big tree, pretty close to your house, you showed right in the beginning,
Right.
that was a native red maple. Did you happen to count the rings?
Well, we haven't, that one's still standing.
Oh,
That one's still
I
there.
thought there was a big one that went down.
The weeping beech and the hemlock, those two came down.
Yeah,
We didn't count the rings.
well, you know how I do that, I know I'm crazy, but actually I can't see good enough to do it, so I have some of the younger guys do it for me.
Right, right.
You know, over.
Yeah, that-
Club. So, yeah, that, I think it was the weeping beech, I think it was the hemlock that I was talking about. That's an old tree.
That's an old tree.
Couple hundred?
Well, you know, it's hard, you can't really tell by size all the time because it might have liked
Yeah,
where it was.
yeah.
And so an 8-foot diameter hemlock in a place that would have been a farm, it was probably introduced with all those other trees.
So it was 8 foot diameter?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I was gonna ask about the other tree, the fern leaf beech that you showed. Right around here
Chestnut?
somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know what the diameter on that is, or the
I have it in the
circumference?
inventory, I can look it up. But,
No, I just,
Yeah.
you know, when you
I don't
get
remember.
that big, do you call it circumference or caliper?
well, arborists tend to go by diameter.
Okay,
Yeah.
diameter.
And people who measure for champion trees,
Yeah.
like each state has champion trees based on size, that's by circumference.
Circumference.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can, if you have one, you can figure the other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, thanks.
Unless
Chris.
you're not good at math.
Really enjoyed your talk, it was great.
And then the
Let's
vision
do a round of
was-
applause.
All right, so I'll introduce Beth, and you know, I'm not a highly credentialed person, so when I introduce people, I tend to introduce people as to how I know them, and I don't tend to go by their credentials. Beth's credentials are listed, you know, on the website.
Chris, the credentials don't matter.
But for people like me to have somebody like Beth, previously, and people here know Dr. Frederick, Dr. Frederick was a mentor to me, and to have people like Beth come up. Beth is somebody who visits all of our offices in New England and probably down to what, New Jersey? Yeah. And so Beth sees a lot that we don't see. And when we're out on properties, to have things that we're unsure of by somebody who knows the science, it just, it brings us so much forward into what we know. And just today in our discussions with rhododendrons, I have so many properties with rhododendrons that look awful. They're yellower than normal this year. And the conclusion was that it wasn't all bad. It was mostly good. And so Beth is somebody who actually, when she comes to my landscapes, I step back and I listen. And I think you'll enjoy Beth as much as I enjoy her visits. So Beth.
Thank you, Chris. First question is, do we still have snacks across the hall?
Yes, we do.
Would everyone like to stand up and get a snack or a glass of water and be hydrated on this warm day? I need exactly 2 minutes, 120 seconds to get set up. But I'd love to see everyone levitate and bear minimum. If you'll just stand, stretch your legs, we'll have no deep vein thrombosis today. Oh, I don't care. No, thank you. No, no worries.
Oh, yeah, he was good.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, beach, ship shape.
We're expanding.
Just follow right back.
No. You told me like, oh, we got it. Should come. Someone should go.
Okay.
Tomorrow. It's only benefits me.
It's
usually I just started being a part of this. Being part of I met Chris It's just nice to be. I try to whenever I can. Yeah, they have those Wednesday nights. Not every week, but yeah, it's been nice to learn the community and always have an opportunity. It is, yeah, but hopefully more people. It's good, yeah. It's always the ability to see as a facet of the industry that I don't get to see. I feel like we do a lot of stuff, but there's always work that I'm not seeing every day. I feel like this next month we're going to make a push to find get like a lot of plants in just before Memorial Day. We'll probably slow down and just plant these bigger jobs. We don't have any I think it's mostly heather right now. So, but I mean, I got you can see what you like. You can take some now. I feel like I haven't been. I've been only once. But I feel like every time I drive by. Well, especially if we were reaching out at the beginning of April and he wasn't set up yet. There was nothing. And 2 weeks later, I showed up. Look at all this stuff. Great. I love seeing well, and now we're top of Portsmouth. It's actually easy to go to Columbus too. I don't know if you've been able to go up there. It's a trip from Newport, but that 15 minutes closer to Portsmouth. Yeah, this fall they're starting to dive in. I know. That's another place that you just have to go and just walk around. It's all like, it could be a family event. Just go walk around and take it all in. Because it really is like, they have so much that blows things out of the water. We're still settling in. We made a really good push in March to be all more set up. We inherited so much material and waste, just kind of junk, still just piles of material from the previous owner that we're trying to call for. Like we have like, oh, we got a couple hours, so we'll go back to the shop and do this or that. It's like, all right, we really make it in those couple hours. I live in Providence, it's way easy. Well, it's actually worked out perfectly. I moved to Providence beginning of August, and then 2 weeks later we moved to Portsmouth. It's like, all right, that's great.
I went way beyond my 120 seconds. I didn't set my time. I'll wait for a few others to. Good afternoon. Oh, let's try it again. Good afternoon. That was better. I just like to see the smiles. That's why I like to do that. And this is very challenging to follow, Chris Fletcher. Aren't you glad you're not me? Because that was amazing. And I really appreciate that. Can we give Chris one more round of applause? And whereas I feel like you really gave the symphony, and you set this up quite nicely, Chris. For me, my sharing with you today is about beech, the beech tree. And I share with you some of the cultivars that are in the trade. They have names like tricolor beech, names like Nicole, Aurea pendula, striata, and a very strange word that has a lot of consonants in it, like Jersrick is the one on the far right. But I start with this, friends. What do you see?
An elephant under a blanket.
So close. It looks like a snake. It looks like an elephant under a blanket.
A snail.
Nematode.
The little.
And I wonder, you said it, it's the Little Prince. Is that how you knew?
Yeah.
Is that how you knew? And we go from Robert Frost to Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And this, in fact, was not a hat. It was a boa constrictor that swallowed an elephant. I share this with you because one of my favorite quotes is this. And here it is, my secret. It is very simple. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. And Chris, I think this just follows so nicely.
It does.
Because you just shared these moments.
Right.
And that those are truly from the heart. I do have some letters after my name, and that tends to be a good thing from time to time. And I am pleased and honored to work with Chris Fletcher. Every property visit with you is an experience for me as well. I see properties through your eyes and your decades of time with these trees in this area. Whereas you have rooted yourself in one location.
I have. I'm a local.
It's exciting for me. I can learn from you so much. And I do bring my stories of my travels and seeing most of the time the same trees in other locations. And what a glorious place to be. This is my first visit to this university. It's an amazing campus, and I love visiting the website and finding pictures of trees. Trees are absolutely integral to this particular location. And the history of these trees, now you might look at this and say, this is not a tree in Rhode Island, and I would say to you that is correct. This is not a tree in Rhode Island. This is a weeping beech elsewhere. I put this picture here for my own sake. For most of us, when we think of our favorite tree, do you think of a large tree? Do you think of a majestic tree? If I were to ask you to describe your favorite tree, would it be large? Would it be amazing? I would challenge each of you to think about the next generation, to think